Welcome to the Caregiver's Corner with your host, Ken Rupert. Ken received board certification from the International Board of Christian Coaches as a Master Christian Life Coach in 2012. He founded the Vitacopia Group to offer life coaching services with a concentrated focus on caregivers. He is the parent of a child with multiple disabilities and a caregiver for his father, who has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Ken knows the struggles caregivers face, and he works tirelessly to mentor, encourage, nurture, and strengthen caregivers. He is the author of the Caregiver's blog, which highlights the stories of caregivers from around the world. On today's program, Ken talks with Dr. Bill Williams, a licensed psychologist in the state of Maryland. Dr. Williams received his Bachelor of Science degree in 1956 from Wilson Teachers College in Washington, D.C. He went on to receive his Master of Education in 1963 from the University of Maryland and his Doctor of Education in 1969 from Duke University. For over 35 years, Dr. Williams served as Executive Director of the Christian Counseling Center in Annapolis and now has a private practice called Full Circle Psychological Services. Before going into full-time practice as a psychologist, Dr. Williams worked in the Montgomery County, Maryland school system for 25 years in varying capacities, such as teaching science and training teachers. He was also the director of the Center for the Neurologically Impaired. From his life experience, as well as his professional practice, Dr. Williams has an intimate understanding of the concerns of caregivers. And now, let's join Ken and Dr. Williams.
Welcome to this edition of Caregiver's Corner. Today I'm talking with Dr. Bill Williams, who is a practicing psychologist in Annapolis. Is that correct?
Right.
Okay. Well, Bill, welcome to the show.
Thank you
for taking the time out of your day to come here and talk about this important issue.
And I'm honored to be here.
Well, that's great. And we are going to start with a question that I think is pertinent to the entire conversation that we're going to have. There is an impact moment when the person realizes they're a caregiver. Sometimes that happens in an instant when a child is born with a disability, and other times it happens when there's a progressive disease, such as Alzheimer's dementia, and the person eventually gets to the place where they realize, I'm now caring for somebody who used to be able to do these things for themselves. So that physical reality often doesn't align with our intellectual acceptance of it. Can you tell me a little bit about the psychology between the physical manifestation of caregiving and the intellectual acceptance and some of the emotions that go into that?
Because sometimes people never get to acceptance.
Explain that a little bit.
All right? Let's imagine you get a phone call at midnight.
Mm-hmm.
Your son has been in an accident and he's on a respirator.
Okay.
The initial thought is panic. This isn't really happening.
Mm-hmm.
Then you realize when you go to the hospital, it is happening. And you may do some bargaining. God, if you're out there, if you will save my son, if you will do something so that he can pull through. Let's imagine that he's a quadriplegic.
Mm-hmm.
Now the next emotion is going to be depression or anger. And the person may go after several months into depression. If depression's first, anger is going to follow. And then it may go back to bargaining again. But eventually a person can get to acceptance. Mm-hmm. It's happened, it's real. Mm-hmm. When a person dies, maybe the son died, the person may never be able to close the casket, can never get to acceptance.
That's figuratively close the casket, right?
Yes.
This is the acceptance part of it, okay.
But what we're looking at is it takes the average person about a year to go through this kind of cycle. Because each time there's an anniversary date, a birth date, Christmas, Thanksgiving, these past memories will flood the person. Mm-hmm. And to get to acceptance usually takes going full cycle around the clock. Now the key would be when this tragedy, when this crisis happens and it's sudden, mm-hmm. the man is looking for facts. What can I do to fix it? I don't believe this. I'm going to get a second opinion.
Okay.
Whereas with the woman's brain, she is very much in the moment, in the emotion. So they see it differently, if that is the question. So they process it differently.
So there's going to be a lag between the physical reality and
Yes.
the intellectual acceptance, and that often has an emotional component, an emotional impact. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not that the guy doesn't feel emotions, but he has to deal with emotions that he's not maybe programmed or wired to deal with. Is that correct?
Think of it this way. With the male brain, with the left hemisphere, it's overdeveloped in terms of facts, analysis, synthesis of information. When emotions are touched, they can be touched, but they're hard to process. The male may see a movie and something touches him, and he may or may not have tears, whereas the woman may be tearing through this entire process and even leave the movie in tears. So they do relate to emotions differently. Now, 80% of men are very strong left hemisphere. 80% of women are very strong right hemisphere, which means the emotions, feelings, sensitivity, and 20% are the other. So that 20% of women are more analytical, and 20% of men are more of the emotional.
Okay. And the impact of the physical reality of caregiving, the intellectual acceptance of it, the emotional processing of it, leads us to this crisis of belief. Henry and Richard Blackaby and Claude King wrote a book called Experiencing God. And they talk about when you hit a crisis of belief and how that impacts the spiritual, because whether you're spiritual or not, as you mentioned, there's the bargaining. There's the God, if this is really happening, do something, right? Even if I hadn't believed in you before, I'm believing enough now to say, do something
That's
to
right.
make this work.
But it's been said there are no atheists in foxholes.
That's true.
That when you are being shot at, when you don't know if you're going to make it, you may say, God, if you're there, help me.
Get me out of this.
Yep.
Okay. So that relationship with God for the caregiver can get to that level of acceptance, but how does grief or denial impact our ability to get to that place of acceptance?
Well, let's imagine a person, that son that was in the accident, that became terminal. And they did not have a belief system. And their belief would be, once he is put in the ground and becomes worm food, that's the end of it. I'll never see him again. With a person who is a believer, who believes that the physical body may die, but the spirit and soul will never die, and I will be able to see my son again perfectly whole. And the son, if he were to survive, would have been so disabled that I can trust God for what he says is that you will see him again, because what the Bible would say is the only thing that dies is our physical body. Our soul and spirit immediately go to be in God's presence.
And so there's a hope.
Yeah, that's the
associated with
difference.
it. That's the difference.
So with the person who has hope, they can deal with it. If they are hopeless, then instead of getting bitter, they get better. Instead of getting better, they become bitter. And that's the difference. If they have a belief system that will support them and a group of people around them that can support them.
So there's that support network is pretty important.
Absolutely. And especially with the caregivers.
So let's talk a little bit about special needs children, in the sense that their lives go through so many different transitions, and the switch is always on for the caregiver. You have a process where you have to manage life, and then you have to manage the care of a loved one, and that switch is never turned off. So there's a static level of stress. Talk about how that impacts the life of the caregiver.
If a caregiver is constantly under pressure, it's like a person who has a very expensive violin, and they don't release the tension on the strings after the concert. That violin will warp. Now, A person has to de-stress daily, or it's cumulative. And the chemicals that are released in the brain, the cortisol and the adrenaline, which are there to give you superhuman energy, because your brain's perceiving it's a crisis. You need to climb a tree, escape from that animal, or fight and defend yourself. That builds up in the system and acts as a poison. If a person doesn't at least have a 22-minute aerobic workout a day, which is able to flush the chemicals out of the muscles, the lactic acid, and things like that that accumulate with stress, then it becomes a poison. And it starts destroying tissue and brain cells.
So you had a statistic from Ohio State University.
Yes.
Could you read that for us?
Sure. What Ohio State found is that 64% of people who are caregivers that have this constant stress will die of stress-related disorders. In the national sense, 54% of people who die because of stress-related disorders. So there's an increase in caregivers that do not get that break, that are constantly under the pressure that wears them down.
And that's the importance of then having a network, having someone who knows or has a passion for caring for the caregiver, that knows to call them, to involve them in something that kind of extracts them out of that constant state of, for lack of a better term, constantly being turned on, constantly
You got it.
running.
You know that our firstborn son was a rubella baby.
Yes.
And it was so important when Steph was home with the children that 2 days a week she would have, we would call it a cleaning lady. But she was just a lady that loved the kids. And whether she cleaned or not didn't matter. She was just there. So on Tuesday, Steph got to a Bible study in Washington. Thursday, she could go and have tea or something with her friends. But she did have that break. And that seemed to help. So our caretaker there, Daisy, made a tremendous impact on the children.
And
She was the one.
obviously on Steph too, because
Oh,
she was
yes.
able to then have the break.
Right.
Well, we were talking probably about a month ago about Billy and the situation, and Steph mentioned a concept called progressive realization. Talk about that a little bit. What exactly, how does that relate to caregiving?
Let's imagine a spouse dies. And after 2 or 3 weeks, and the people start calling, and the reality hits, this really has happened. Then the adjustment, seeing things around the house that should remind you of your spouse, places where you visited, and for them to get to the reality and get on with their life usually takes a year. So it's a progressive realization when you have a special needs child, or you have a parent that is suffering with Alzheimer's. This is really happening, and it's painful.
And it's going to go on for the life of the child.
That's right. But some people would say, but if I just pray hard enough, he'll be fixed.
It'll be fixed. And we often pray to fix.
Yeah, well, we have one fixed.
Yeah.
But about 1 time in 10, when I know people pray for a miracle, they get it. And 9 times out of 10, when they pray for a miracle, they don't get it.
So while we're talking about statistics, I wanted to read a couple of statistics and then talk about the dichotomy between the male caregiver and the female caregiver. The AARP estimates that about 66% of caregivers are women, even when a man is available to provide care. The National Women's Network, Health Network, estimates that that number is actually between 59 and 75%. Why is there such a disproportionate number of caregivers that are women? One could fall back on a statistic that maybe more men tend to degenerate faster in older age, but that's not the case when it comes to special needs children or combat wounded veterans.
That's right.
So what drives or motivates a woman to be more of a caregiver by nature than a male?
She can sense the pain, not only in the child, when she takes her child out and not able to interact with others, and she knows something is wrong. But to come to the realization that this is something that probably will exist for all his life, need to make plans when we're gone that someone would care for him. And this is an ongoing process of trying to adjust what do we do to provide, well, let's just say, for Billy. So the woman is in tune with the feelings. The man, if he can't fix it, he will try to avoid.
Okay, that's the key.
Try to avoid the pain that he can't fix.
And that kind of takes me to something that I wrote in a recent article, and I'll quote this. It says, men and women assume the role differently, where women tend to overcommit to the caregiving role. Often leaving no room for self-care, men tend to withdraw due to overwhelming stress that accompanies the inability to solve the problem. In an effort to be in control, it is the caregiver who often feels completely out of control. But this emotional tension of wanting to control but not being able to creates anxiety, confusion, elevated levels of stress, and stress that never really goes away. Is that what we're talking about?
Yes.
We're talking about that disconnection. The men are having a problem processing the emotion, first of all, but then second of all, they're facing a situation that they cannot fix. And so it's almost an avoidance technique.
It is avoidance. Because to come home and see their child this way, they may find it's so important to get out and play golf on Saturday. Or it's so important.
Let's not attack golfers.
No.
Just kidding.
Well,
That's my
to
escape.
Get out and do something, because to be home, it's sad.
It's almost painful.
It is
It's almost
painful.
an emotion of painful.
It is painful. It is really painful to see your child suffering. So they escape.
They escape. How can a man become better engaged in the process?
It doesn't come easy. He has to make a commitment. It's like when I'm working with, let's say, a couple, and they're not getting along. I say there are 4 things that if you will work on, your relationship with your wife is going to get better. Number 1, if you can communicate love and respect, if you can exchange meaningful touches every day. Average woman needs 8 to 12 meaningful touches a day. Our special needs child need even more. To be able to sit and listen to them, talk, even though their talk may not make sense. Billy didn't talk till he was 5 years old. And when he started to talk, the teacher from the school came by and said, "Do you know Billy started to talk today?" We would say, "Would you go and get Susie's jacket?" And he would do it. And we did not think he had that ability. So these are the kinds of things we're looking at, of what can we fix, what's happening, to become aware of it. And then the 4th thing is to be able to do fun things together. And that could be rolling on the floor, wrestling. It could be doing painting.
So one of the activities that my son enjoys is listening to fiddle music, videos of fiddle music. He
Yes.
loves the fiddle. And in the process of doing that, he's taken to a bowling game on the computer. And one of the things that I like to do is I will sit and play a golf game on my iPhone, and he calls out and he just wants me to come and sit next to him and play golf.
There you go.
And it's very interesting because he's started this process, but he'll lean over to me and he'll say, "Come on, Daddy, you can do that." And he'll start encouraging me, and then he'll ask me to encourage him. And I think that that's a great bonding moment. But
Yes, it is.
so it doesn't necessarily mean to be, it doesn't need to be meaningful activity, because in Daniel's world, that is meaningful to him.
That's right. Being together, being able to touch, communicating love and respect, and talking to him.
Yeah. So the guy has to be intentional about being involved.
It doesn't come easy.
And no, it doesn't. Because there is that managing life and then managing the care. But what could a woman do to encourage her husband in a way that would encourage him to be involved? Because some guys are distant, or they're removed from it. They're kind of avoiding it. What could a woman lovingly do that encourages him, and where he's not going to read it as, something that's attacking his character?
Right, telling me what to do.
Exactly.
Let's imagine that the relationship between the husband and wife is a good relationship, that they are a team. If the wife were to say, would you help me with this? I am so tired. Would you take care of whatever? The chances are he would want to. If the wife is asking for help, if she were to make it a command, it may not come across as well.
Gotcha. So it is in the communication of the need.
Yes.
The need is there, but it's how it's communicated.
And sometimes we call it you messages versus I messages. You
Explain that a little
messages,
bit.
would you help me?
Mhm.
I want you to do that. That doesn't go as well.
So
You
there's a
message.
difference in how you message it.
Yeah.
So it's, would you help me do
You got it.
whatever it
You
is,
got
as
it.
opposed to, I want you to do.
I want you
That's
to
interesting.
do the laundry.
Mhm.
Big difference between those two words.
That's interesting. So let's just talk a little bit about making a transition for the spouse or the family member of a combat wounded veteran. As we have a lot of veterans in Carroll County.
Yes.
We've served many years in combat zones now, in Afghanistan and Iraq. And a lot of these people who are coming back, these veterans who are coming back, have either physically left part of themselves in another country, or they've emotionally left part of themselves in another country. How is that transition made smooth? How do you smooth out that transition? Because I'm sure there's a lot of emotions that are, whether it's PTSD or whether it's a physical wound. How is a family to adjust to that kind of transition? From the emotional, from the intellectual, from the psychological point of view.
Let's imagine they had a good marriage. They were truly in love with each other. That the wife, when her husband comes home and he doesn't have his legs, or his vision is gone, if she is able to communicate to him, I love you, just as much as I did before you went, because his self-esteem will be wounded more than the physical wounds. He will think, I'm not adequate. How could she love me? And that's the reason why suicide is such a high rate among people coming back with trauma. Whether it's PTSD, whether it's traumatic brain injury, the fact that the male is different, not able to do what he could do, is devastating to self-esteem. But her ability to do the four things that we were just talking about, love and respect, meaningful touches, sharing feelings, and doing fun things together, is a thing she could do. It seemed like at the University of Colorado, about 30 years ago, that research came out. And I have used that with clients, I would say daily. The four things to do to bond.
Okay. And there's also 4 lines of communication, right? And,
Yes.
And where would you find that somebody who has been put in a stressful situation, how can a caregiver communicate to those around them without sounding like they're complaining about their circumstances? They just want to share their pain. They want to share what they're feeling without being condemned for feeling it. How does that work, the communication model, and then how can a caregiver use it to communicate that pain?
Well, if the spouse, let's say, of this returning soldier is feeling those emotions, I would say the worst thing for her to do is to say it to her husband, because it could be devastating. I just feel this, I just feel that. She needs someone she can talk to besides her husband. But there's a law in therapy that says what you don't talk out, your body acts out.
Interesting.
So she needs to have someone, a trusted friend, maybe a prayer warrior, that she can go over with this, but not in any way to say to her husband how much it hurts her to see her disability, which he can't fix.
Because he's already, as you said, wounded,
Yes.
feeling like he's no longer able to do what he was able to do.
Right.
So that's just a continued wounding at that point.
That's right.
So those in the community who know people who either have a special needs child, who are in the throes of managing the care of their aging parent, or even providing care for a wounded veteran, what can we tell our audience that would encourage them to learn to walk alongside of a caregiver and be that person that can minister to the caregiver, so it's not reflected back on the person being cared for?
Yes. If the caregiver has a person that can walk alongside, like the life coach, like the kind of work that you are getting into, then you can be her or his encourager. You can provide information. You would be able to let her know about what she's feeling and be able to accept her feelings. It would be impossible for the wounded warrior to accept her feelings.
So life coaching is one of those aspects with the niche of caregiver coaching that really looks at the whole picture.
Absolutely.
And that whole picture being a mentor to
Yep.
provide information, an encourager to bolster up the self-esteem of the person who's providing care, because
got it.
that stress will break that down.
Yep.
And then a nurturer, and then somebody who can strengthen. So we're looking at the entire package in that. And we're also talking about addressing the physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual wholeness of the person.
Right.
And having a plan going forward. A plan is a critical part of life. If you want to manage life well, you manage it with a plan.
Yep.
You make accommodations for unexpected situations that arise. But for the most part, you're moving towards a target. And coaching is really about that, right? The four pillars of coaching is you want to optimize performance, you want to create focus, you want to maintain accountability, and you want to drive results. The caregiver coach does those elements of coaching and applies them to the mental, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual aspects of a person, and then does it through mentoring, encouraging, nurturing, and strengthening. Is there a way that the untrained person, the person you're sitting next to in church, the person you work next to, is there a way for somebody who is not a caregiver but knows a caregiver to package that and minister to somebody that way? Talk about the effects of that, the ministering of somebody who's not necessarily trained in life coaching, but how somebody can be a mentor, how somebody can be an encourager, how they can be a strengthener. And
Sometimes it's writing a card, a note, thinking about you.
okay.
Sometimes it's sending over a dessert. It could be giving something that lets that person know you care. And that is a way. Bob Schuler's wife, he used to be on television.
Is that Robert
Power.
Schuler?
Yes.
Okay, yes.
And his wife, was famous for baking apple pies. But she wasn't a very good talker. And when Bob Schuler would hear about a person in the parish, in the congregation, that was not doing well, she would bake them an apple pie. That was the way she communicated.
Kind of through acts of service.
Yeah, act of service, there you go.
So there's five, as we know, five love languages.
languages,
And act of
yes.
service is one of those love languages.
Yes.
And the love languages, let's just go into that for a little bit. A love language meets the person who it's being expressed to where they are, correct?
Yes.
So if my love language is affirmation, for me to affirm somebody whose love language is gifts, it wouldn't be received well.
That's right.
Yeah. So it really is about learning more about the person and understanding what their needs are. In one case, baking an apple pie for somebody would be great. It could be seen as an act of service. It's also a gift.
Yes?
But the important thing is for the person who wants to come alongside the caregiver is to understand the caregiver and almost anticipate their need.
Yes. If when we take a look at the love languages, and one is a word, one could be a touch, another would be a gift, an act of kindness, doing something special, inviting them out to lunch. If you know the love language, you could do that, but sometimes you don't know the person's love language. But by sending a card, sending the apple pie, it would make a difference.
And it's really all about relationship.
Yeah. That a person cares enough.
That even a simple card can communicate, I care about you.
That's
You're
right.
important. You're of value. And any way I can help.
Now with the husband and wife, they should know each other's love language. And if the love language of the wife was touch, but the husband would give gifts, they're not in sync. But if you give the love language that the person loves to get, that's the difference.
The other acts don't necessarily not speak of love, but it's not received of love. Is that kind
That's
of
right.
the concept
Yes.
behind it?
Right. It's appreciated, but it doesn't hit their love button.
Ah, gotcha. So that's the key. So a good way for a husband and wife who are the caretakers or the caregivers for a special needs child is to know that love language, and then because there's always that extra level of stress, is to try to touch the love button as much as possible as opposed to just doing things, because in the situation you tend to do things that you have to do.
Sure.
Many times we hear the phrase, I don't know how you do it. And our answer, quite honestly, is because we have to. Who else is going to if we don't? But between the husband and wife, there needs to be that connection, that understanding, that just this little simple, if it's a word of affirmation,
Yes.
if it's an act of service, whatever it is. Now, so the husband is gifts, and the wife's is affirmation. Knowing each other's love language and knowing their own. For instance, if I know that my wife's is affirmation and mine is gifts, when she says something that's affirming to me, I can learn how to receive that as love, right?
You
Because
can.
I know that that's what she's trying to communicate.
That's right. But it
even though
doesn't-
it's not the way I normally would do it.
Right. You can receive it, but it doesn't hit your hot button.
Okay. But in caregiving, that hot button is often covered.
That's right.
With all the stress.
And let's say your wife appreciates the meaningful touch. And to make sure when you come home, if her love language is touch, that she gets her 8 to 12 touches. You don't have to check them off on a list.
If you're
But
a
you
list
just
person, I can see you doing that.
Yes.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you taking your time to come out today. I know it was a long drive for you, but your insight into this is a complicated package that we're dealing with when it comes to caregiving. Regardless of whether you're caring for your parent who's aging, whether you're caring for a spouse who's got a terminal illness, or a child with special needs, or even a returning veteran, it is a complicated package. And I think that your insight into helping unpack that a little bit would help our audience to know that if they're not caregivers, they can certainly learn how to help
Yes.
the caregivers that they know. Is there any other insight, any other information that you would like to provide our viewers that would help them in any aspect of this?
Well, maybe it would be this one. We are given spiritual gifts, of which there is approximately 25. And some people have the gift of mercy, about 1 person in 20. And this is a person, when they know someone's in pain, they want to They don't have to be asked. They are at the door. Can I help? I'm thinking of a grandmother in California. Her name was Marion, lived alone. And she heard that her cousin, who lived in Annapolis, had a stroke. She got on a plane, and she spent the next 2 years ministering at home with her special friend. Eventually, she was put in a nursing home. But Marion had the gift of mercy, and she just thrived on helping people. Now, 19 out of 20 of us do not have that special gift. But at least we can make an attempt to show it, even though it doesn't come easy. With a spiritual gift, it comes easy.
Sure.
And the people that receive it know that's special. So if you don't have the gift, you can still develop some of the skills of the gift. But it takes effort.
So I've written 2 books, one of which talks about spiritual gifts and the other aspects of who a person is. It's called Finding Your Niche. And that book goes through the spiritual gifts and the different things of temperament and the different ways you receive knowledge and stuff like that. So that might be a resource that could help people in that sense.
Sure.
The other book that I wrote is actually called Empathy. And I think that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
That gift that says, I'm willing to set aside my position. I'm willing to enter into somebody else's struggle and walk alongside of them until they get to the place of restoration.
You got it. There's a difference between sympathy, where we feel sorry for a person, and empathy, where we can relate to their pain.
And it's as simple as that.
Yep.
Oh. I really do appreciate you coming out. I appreciate your knowledge. And I really appreciate your friendship over the last 20 years.
Well,
thank you so much for coming out.
Pleasure.
All right.
The new challenges experienced by a caregiver often work to isolate that person because the difficulties are not easily understood by those who are not directly affected. Even family members can become distant due to the inability to process the needs and experiences of the caregiver. What do you say to someone who is struggling with the new reality of becoming a caregiver? To the wife of 50 years who is now making decisions about the care of her husband, who once was so capable. To the young couple who, after the birth of their first child, realizes that life will never be the same because of a birth trauma or genetic disorder. To the family of the wounded veteran, who now requires 24/7, 365 care because of his injuries, both seen and unseen. In all of these situations, someone becomes a caregiver despite the lack of preparation. Life can change in an instant. Everything you've ever known can become unknown, and every goal you have ever made changes into a single goal to just make it through the day. Life takes on a different perspective when everything that seemed so important yesterday becomes so trivial today. Those who become caregivers often do so without prior warning or training. For almost all caregivers, knowledge is gained through on-the-job training in a discipline that is not well defined. The physical transition from parent, spouse, or family member to caregiver is instantaneous. However, the intellectual, emotional, and spiritual transition often takes much longer. The physical transition happens at the moment of birth or diagnosis or injury. However, intellectually, there's a lag because the mind is trying to rationalize what is being experienced versus what a person expected to happen. Failing to be able to rationalize these two, the mind continues to try to define what is being experienced so the problem can be identified, the solution determined, and the steps taken to solve the problem. However, the problem cannot be fixed, so the mind continues to resist the new reality. In order for the mind to catch up with the physical realities of being a caregiver, the mind has to come to a place of acceptance. For a man, accepting a problem that cannot be solved is not comfortable. This inability to fix the situation begins to invade the emotional aspects of a man's life. and results in anger and fear. For a woman, she develops an unrealistic belief that there was something more she could have or something should have been done. The inability to correctly identify the cause and effect of the circumstances leads to guilt and depression. Neither of these two responses are rational, but they are very normal. Both men and women experience deep emotional suffering when their child is born with a disability, or a spouse of many years is diagnosed with Alzheimer's, dementia, or a terminal disease, or a veteran returns home with PTSD or combat injuries. The man, experiencing emotions which he is uncomfortable, begins to wall himself off from the emotions. He finds ways to avoid the situation and becomes emotionally distant. He desperately needs someone to walk alongside of him, but he would not admit it because it would be a sign of weakness. Unfortunately, if and when he tries to share his pain, many men who are not in his situation fail to notice his cry for help. This creates a downward spiral of separation until it begins to impact his spiritual walk. The woman, experiencing emotions that expose her deepest beliefs about herself, begins to overengage. The natural ability of a woman to nurture becomes like a gene that overexpresses a protein and causes abnormal cell growth. Everything concerning her loved one becomes more important than her own needs. Without caution, she experiences weariness. She is physically exhausted, intellectually spent, emotionally drained, and spiritually weak. The psychological impact of being a caregiver needs to be acknowledged and addressed. If you are a caregiver, don't resist the need to talk to a professional about your struggles. It is natural to be confused about life when it doesn't turn out as you had planned. And it is not a sign of weakness to admit you are struggling. Actually, it is a sign of strength to face your pain and do something about it. And that is something to think about.